On a frozen Christmas night, when the mountain closed every road and the wind erased every footprint, a broken police officer and 3 newborn German Shepherd puppies were left alone between life and silence. What happened next would change a hidden town and awaken a miracle no one was ready to believe. If you have ever felt lost in a storm like this, then this story is for you. Tell me where you are watching from and leave your comment below. And if stories of hope, love, and second chances touch your heart, please press subscribe to support the channel and walk with us through this journey of quiet miracles. Everfrost lay buried beneath a white silence on the night of December 24th, the kind of mountain town that seemed carved from frost itself, with pine roofs bent under heavy snow and street lamps glowing like distant stars trapped in glass. The wind moved through the narrow streets like a living thing, whispering through frozen signs and shuttered windows, carrying with it the promise that no one should be out on the pass tonight. Beyond the last row of houses, the mountain road twisted upward into darkness, a ribbon of ice devoured by an advancing blizzard. That was where Claire Morgan drove alone. Claire was 31, tall and lean, with a disciplined posture shaped by years in uniform, her dark blonde hair pulled tight beneath her patrol cap, her face pale but steady, marked by sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of cold steel. She had the quiet intensity of someone who listened more than she spoke, a woman known in town for being firm but fair, distant but dependable. The disappearance of her father when she was 9 years old had carved a hollow into her character that never quite closed, leaving her with a constant need for control, for order, for answers she had never received. That night, she gripped the steering wheel with gloved hands as snow lashed against the windshield like thrown sand, her patrol lights cutting narrow tunnels through the storm as she answered what should have been a routine check along the pass before the roads fully closed. The world vanished in white motion, and then the black ice claimed her without warning. The tires lost their hold in a single breathless second. The cruiser spun, struck the guardrail with a dull metallic cry, and overturned into the shallow ravine below. The impact crushed the air from Claire's lungs and threw her into a spinning darkness where sound became distant and slow. When she came back to herself, she was half crushed against the door, her left shoulder torn open by twisted metal, her ribs screaming in protest with every shallow breath. Blood soaked through the seam of her uniform, already stiffening in the cold. The radio was dead, the screen shattered. Her phone showed nothing but a helpless, no signal. Outside, the storm howled as if celebrating a victory. Claire forced the door open with a cry that tore from somewhere deep in her chest and dragged herself into the snow, each movement a battle against pain and numbness. The cold seized her instantly, wrapping her skin in burning ice. She staggered a few steps, and then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost thought her mind had invented it. A thin, broken whimper trembling beneath the roar of the wind. She turned her flashlight toward the sound, its beam shuddering across snowdrifts and broken branches, until it caught the edge of a wooden crate half buried beneath the storm. Inside were 3 German Shepherd puppies, no more than 6 weeks old, their bodies no larger than bundled gloves, their fur wet and clumped with ice. Crystals. One was barely moving, its tiny chest stuttering in uneven, desperate motions. Another writhed weakly, and the third watched in silence, dark eyes wide and unblinking. Claire's heart seized in her chest as if struck. She dropped to her knees beside the crate, ignoring the way pain flared white-hot through her body. With trembling hands, she pulled off her thermal layer, wrapping it clumsily around the puppies, drawing them together into a single fragile knot of warmth. The weakest one felt terrifyingly light in her hands, its heartbeat a faint flutter against her palm. She clicked her flashlight into SOS mode and set it atop the crate, sending sharp pulses of light into the blizzard, a lonely signal swallowed almost instantly by the storm. She tried to lift the crate, but her strength failed her. The world tilted and swam as hypothermia crept through her blood. Still, she dragged it inch by inch toward the edge of the road, leaving a dark trail of blood behind her that vanished beneath falling snow almost as quickly as it formed. By the time she reached the asphalt, her vision was tunneling into gray, the cold no longer burning, but strangely distant. She collapsed beside the crate, one arm draped protectively over it, her breath fogging weakly in the air. Somewhere far away, the weakest puppy gave one more thin sound, and then even that seemed to fade. The night might have ended there, if not for the sudden intrusion of headlights slicing through the storm like the eyes of some ancient mechanical beast. A battered pickup truck crawled along the pass with stubborn resolve, tires chained and engine growling low. The driver, Noah Carter, stepped down into the storm with a controlled urgency that spoke of long familiarity with danger. Noah was 38, broad-shouldered and powerfully built beneath his worn coat, his dark hair cropped short in military fashion, his face etched with quiet scars of fatigue rather than visible wounds. His eyes were dark and steady, carrying the weight of memories he rarely spoke of. Once a battlefield medic and rescue operator, he had vanished into the wilderness years earlier after surviving a mission in which everyone under his command died beneath an avalanche overseas. Survival had become his private burden, and isolation his chosen penance. He spotted the overturned cruiser first, then the faint blinking light beside the road. When he reached Claire, he moved instantly, methodically, checking her pulse, her breathing, stabilizing her injured shoulder with practiced hands despite the violence of the storm. Only after he secured her as best he could did he turn to the crate. The sight of the 3 puppies drew the slightest tightening at the corners of his eyes. He lifted the weakest gently, pressing his fingers to its tiny chest, then began careful compressions and breath, with the precision of someone who had fought death on far harsher grounds. The puppy's body shuddered, once, twice, and then a thin, fragile breath returned. Noah exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his own life in his lungs along with the puppy's. He tried to radio for help, but the mountains answered only with static and wind. The roads were sealed. No ambulance could reach this pass tonight. For long seconds Noah stood in the storm, snow crusting on his lashes, weighing impossible choices. Then he lifted Claire into his arms with a quiet grunt of effort, carried the crate beneath his other arm, and turned back toward the waiting truck. The drive to his nearest cabin took nearly an hour over roads that tried to kill him at every bend. By the time he reached the cabin's fading porch light, Claire was barely conscious, her skin as pale as the snow that clung to her coat, and the puppies were cold and frighteningly still again. The cabin was small, built of dark timber and stone, a solitary square of warmth carved into the wilderness. Inside, Noah moved with efficient purpose, laying Claire near the fire, cutting away her blood-soaked uniform, disinfecting and binding her wounds with supplies salvaged from his old rescue kit. He worked silently, jaw set, his movement steady despite the tremor of memory that flickered in his eyes as he fought to keep another life from slipping away. When he turned to the puppies, he placed them beneath lamplight and warmth, rubbing their tiny bodies with dry cloth, breathing gentle life into the smallest one again and again until its heartbeat steadied. The storm battered the cabin walls like an angry ocean, but inside, something fragile and stubbornly alive refused to surrender. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fractured glimpses of a stranger's face leaning over her, of 3 tiny shapes moving weakly beside the fire, of shadows dancing across timber walls like living spirits. At one point, she whispered a single broken word, barely audible beneath the storm, "Dad," before sinking back into fevered sleep. Noah did not hear it, but the moment settled into the room like a quiet premonition. Outside, the blizzard tightened its grip on Everfrost, sealing roads, burying tracks, and erasing all signs of the tragedy that had unfolded on the mountain pass. Inside the cabin, 2 wounded souls and 3 newborn lives hovered on the edge between loss and survival as Christmas Eve stretched endlessly through the frozen dark. The cabin stood like a stubborn ember against the raging night, its single window glowing faintly through the storm, as if breathing defiance into the teeth of winter. Snow buried its steps within minutes of being cleared, the wind pressing against its walls with a living force. Inside, warmth fought for every inch of air. Noah Carter moved between fire and shadows with measured urgency, his large frame bent carefully over the fragile lives he had dragged back from the mountain pass. The puppies lay on a folded blanket near the hearth, 3 trembling bundles of damp fur and uncertain breath. Their bodies were tiny, ribs barely padded by flesh, their ears still half folded in the clumsy softness of early life. Noah worked with a discipline carved into him by distant wars and colder nights, placing heated water packs wrapped in cloth beneath their bellies, rubbing their limbs in small, steady circles to coax blood and warmth back into frozen veins. One of them, the smallest, lay frighteningly still again, its sides barely rising. Noah pressed his mouth close to its muzzle and breathed gently, rhythmically, the way he once had for soldiers whose lungs had been stolen by smoke and dust. After long seconds that stretched like years, the puppy twitched, coughed weakly, and drew in a shallow breath. Noah released a slow exhale, his shoulders lowering a fraction, though the wariness never fully left his eyes. He had learned long ago that survival was not a promise, only a moment-by-moment negotiation. Claire lay several feet away on a narrow cot near the fire, wrapped in thick blankets, her skin pale beneath a sheen of sweat as fever wrestled with cold. Even unconscious, she held the rigid stillness of someone who had trained her body to endure. Her dark blonde hair lay loose over the pillow now, damp with melted snow, a stark contrast to the controlled figure she had been on the road. From time to time, her brow tightened, her lips parting as if to speak to someone locked far away behind her eyes. Noah glanced at her between tending the puppies, the lines of concern on his face deepening each time her breath hitched. The storm clawed at the cabin, howling around its corners and down the chimney like an animal denied entry. Midnight passed, unnoticed. Somewhere beneath the chaos of wind and fire, Christmas arrived without ceremony. At last, the smallest puppy stabilized enough that Noah dared ease his hands away. The other two stirred more strongly now, one wriggling with restless energy despite the chill, the other watching everything with silent, alert eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. Noah studied them briefly, then spoke aloud for the first time since entering the cabin, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You've got a fighter's heart," he murmured to the weakest one. "You'll need a name if you're planning on staying." He looked to the restless one that kept nudging its siblings with clumsy paws. "You're Trouble," he added quietly, almost with a hint of dry amusement. When Claire stirred again, it was not with a cry of pain, but with a sharp intake of breath, as though she had surfaced suddenly from deep water. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly gathering the firelight, the timber walls, the stranger standing over three impossibly small lives. For a long second, she did not speak. Then her gaze found the puppies, and something in her face broke and softened at the same time. "They're alive," she whispered hoarsely. Noah inclined his head. "For now. And if the night has any mercy left, they'll still be breathing by morning." Claire tried to push herself up and failed, a faint sound escaping her as pain flared through her ribs. Noah was at her side in an instant, one hand steadying her shoulder with careful restraint. "Don't move," he said gently but firmly. "Your body already fought enough for one night." She obeyed, falling back against the pillow, her eyes never leaving the puppies. "I thought I lost them," she murmured. "I thought I lost everything out there." Noah said nothing. Loss was a language he understood too well to offer cheap translations. The hours passed in a strange, suspended quiet, measured by the crackle of firewood and the faint movements of tiny bodies drawing uncertain breath. When the weakest puppy stirred again, stronger this time, Claire found herself naming it without thinking, the word leaving her lips like instinct rather than decision. "Ash," she said softly, watching the gray smudged fur around its muzzle. "Because even after a fire, there are still embers left." Noah regarded the puppy, then nodded once. The restless one earned its name moments later by tumbling clumsily over Ash and nearly rolling into the hearth before Noah caught it. "Leo," Claire said faintly, despite the pain that lined her smile. All that noise in such a small body. The last puppy, the quiet observer with eyes too serious for its age, received its name in silence. It had not whined or struggled once, only watched, absorbing the world with calm attention. "Star," Claire whispered finally, "because it hasn't fallen yet." Noah repeated the names under his breath as if anchoring them into existence. He had not planned to let anything take root inside his life again, least of all three fragile lives that could shatter with the slightest mistake. And yet, as dawn crept slowly beneath the blizzard clouds, he found himself watching their tiny chests rise and fall with a vigilance that felt dangerously close to hope. Claire drifted in and out of wakefulness, fevered dreams weaving with reality. Each time she surfaced, she spoke a little more, fragments at first, then longer pieces as exhaustion loosened the tight grip she held on her own past. She told him about the town, about patrol nights when the streets went quiet and loneliness pressed in from all sides. She told him about her father, Thomas Morgan, who had vanished one winter evening when she was 9, leaving behind a half-finished dinner and a promise to be back before dark. The official report had said missing, presumed dead, but no body was ever found, no truth ever fully delivered. "I kept waiting for him," she said softly, her eyes unfocused on the ceiling beams. "For years, I kept thinking if I became strong enough, fast enough, good enough at saving other people, maybe he'd find his way back to me." Noah listened in silence, feeding the fire as she spoke, each word falling into him like snow into an open wound. When it was his turn to speak, the words came reluctantly, as if pried loose from a place that had long been sealed. He told her about the mountain overseas, about the white roar that swallowed his team without warning, about the hands that slipped from his as the snow took them one by one. "I made it out," he said quietly. "I don't know why. Some nights I think survival was a mistake. Some nights I think it was a debt." Claire turned her head toward him, pain and understanding crossing her features in equal measure. "Maybe it was neither," she said weakly. "Maybe it was just unfinished." They fell into silence after that, a silence different from the one that had filled the cabin before. This one was not empty. It was shared. When morning finally pushed pale gray light through the small window, the storm had softened, but not yet released its grip. Ash lifted its head for the first time on its own, a weak but determined motion that drew a rare smile from Noah. Leo squeaked and kicked, as if challenging the entire world. Star watched the light with quiet intensity, as though memorizing it. Noah prepared thin formula from emergency supplies, feeding each of them with hands that had once cradled weapons and medical tools, but now steadied a bottle smaller than his palm. Claire watched every movement with a tenderness she had not allowed herself in years. 3 fragile lives now lay between her and the man she had met in the storm, and without realizing it, both of them had already stepped onto a path neither had chosen, but neither could now abandon. Outside, snow still fell, softer than before, like the world exhaling after holding its breath too long. Inside the cabin, on a Christmas morning that belonged to no calendar and every soul at once, 3 small heartbeats steadied between 2 broken lives that had not yet learned how to heal, but had, for the first time in a long while, chosen not to disappear. The storm loosened its grip on Everfrost 2 days later, not with mercy, but with exhaustion, as if the mountain itself had finally exhaled after a long, furious struggle. Snow still lay thick across rooftops and roads, but the wind quieted, and the sky broke open into a pale, aching blue that hurt the eyes after so many hours of darkness. The road to the cabin was cleared just enough for emergency vehicles to crawl through like wounded animals searching for shelter. When the rescue team arrived, Claire was barely awake, her fever still clinging to her veins like a stubborn shadow. The puppies were warm, fed, and breathing steadily now, each wrapped in layers of cloth and quiet determination. Noah stood near the doorway as they carried Claire out, his expression unreadable, his hands empty for the first time since he had pulled her from the storm. Before the medics loaded her into the ambulance, he placed something into her palm. It was a small, jagged piece of rusted metal, cold and heavy despite its size, etched with a faded symbol that time had not fully erased. Claire's fingers curled around it reflexively, sensing without understanding that it mattered. "It was wedged inside the crate," Noah said quietly. "It didn't look like part of the box." Claire met his eyes through the fog of pain and exhaustion and nodded once, trusting the weight of the object more than she trusted her own fading thoughts. At the hospital in Everfrost, the hours blurred into a rhythm of needles, stitched flesh, antiseptic light, and restrained movement. Her shoulder required careful repair, her ribs would take weeks to heal, and the hypothermia had left her weak but alive. The puppies were transferred to the town's veterinary clinic for round-the-clock care, instantly becoming the quiet heartbeat of the building, as nurses and staff whispered over them like guardians of something sacred. Claire asked about them before she asked about her own prognosis, and when she learned they had survived the night intact, She closed her eyes and cried without sound. It was only later, alone in the quiet of her hospital room, as dusk folded back over the snowbound town, that she studied the rusted metal Noah had given her. The symbol on it gnawed at her with an uneasy familiarity. A shield shape, a stylized canine head within it, and beneath, the faint remnants of a training code. Her breath caught in her chest. She had seen that symbol before, not in the town, not on any modern unit, but in a file she had not dared to open in years. When her strength returned enough to sit upright, she requested access to the state military archives through her department credentials. The request was flagged, questioned, delayed, then finally approved with the cool indifference of bureaucracy. Hours later, she stared at a grainy digital scan of an insignia identical to the one in her hand. Beneath it, the designation read, K-9 Tactical Training Program, Echo Division. Closed, 20 years. Prior. Her pulse quickened painfully against tender ribs as she scrolled. The last operational base location was listed in coordinates she knew too well, a forgotten stretch of mountain forest less than 40 miles from Everfrost. And then she saw the name. Senior Handler, Thomas Morgan. The world tilted without moving. For a long moment, Claire could only stare at the screen, her heartbeat roaring in her ears as if the storm had returned inside her body. Her father had not simply vanished into winter air. He had belonged to something hidden, something buried, something sealed off and forgotten by official record. When she was released from the hospital a week later, the snow had hardened into jagged crystal under clear skies, and Everfrost moved slowly back toward life. Claire's arm was bound in a sling, her movements careful and deliberate, but her eyes burned with a focus sharper than pain. Noah waited in the truck outside, silent as ever, and when she slid into the passenger seat, she placed the metal fragment between them without a word. He recognized the symbol instantly. "You found it?" he said quietly. "My father's name is on that base," Claire replied. Noah did not ask questions. He only turned the truck toward the mountains. The road to Echo Base was little more than an erased scar through the forest. Snow lay undisturbed across it, as if no one had passed that way in decades. The pines crowded close, tall and dark, their branches heavy with white that fell in sudden size as the truck pushed deeper into the forgotten terrain. When they reached the perimeter, the fence was little more than a skeleton of rusted wire and leaning posts. Beyond it, shapes emerged from the snow like the bones of something ancient. Low buildings half swallowed by drifts. A collapsed training yard, the ghost of a watchtower listing toward the trees. The sign at the gate hung crooked, barely legible beneath layers of frost and corrosion. Claire brushed snow from the metal with shaking hands until the words surfaced. Echo Base K-9. Training facility. Her breath left her in a trembling exhale. Inside the central structure, the air was stale and frozen, carrying the scent of old oil, dust, and something long abandoned by warmth. Their footsteps echoed through the hollow space, as if the building itself were trying to remember sound. In a rear office, they found filing cabinets overturned, papers scattered and partially burned, the remnants of a hurried evacuation. Claire moved through the debris with mounting urgency, her free hand riffling through folders as if guided by instinct rather than sight. And then she found it. A brittle training log marked with her father's handwriting, unmistakable in its sharp, disciplined strokes. She traced his name on the cover as if touching skin through time. The entries spoke of dogs trained not only for tracking and detection, but for battlefield extraction under extreme conditions. The last pages grew erratic, detailing unauthorized access to the compound, unknown groups encroaching on the perimeter, missing equipment, and escalating threats. The final entry ended mid-sentence. Beside the desk, Noah uncovered scorch marks along the walls, not old enough to belong to the base's original shutdown. "This place didn't die 20 years ago," he said grimly. "Someone came back." They moved deeper into the compound until they reached the ruins of a kennel wing. The gates were bent and blackened, and beneath the debris, half buried in ash and ice, lay traces of fresh disturbance. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The crate that had held Ash, Leo, and Star had not come from nowhere. It had come from here. Her father's world had not only existed, It had reached across decades to place those 3 lives in her arms on the darkest night of the year. As they stepped back into the cold daylight, the forest pressed in with heavy silence, as if aware that its secret had shifted. Claire stood at the gate for a long time, her emotions warring between grief and revelation, between the little girl who had waited by the window for a father who never returned and the woman who now stood on the threshold of his hidden life. "He didn't disappear without meaning," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "He was protecting something. Or someone." Noah watched her from a few steps away, recognizing in her the same fragile resolve he had seen in himself years earlier on another mountain under another sky. "Then the past isn't finished with you yet," he said. Claire closed her eyes against the sting of cold and memory. "Neither am I." As they drove back toward Everfrost, the mountains stood silent behind them, guarding Echo Base once more beneath snow and shadow. But the silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. Echo Base did not feel abandoned the second time Claire stepped through its broken gate. The forest stood too still, the air too tight, as if the land itself had drawn a slow, fearful breath, and was waiting for something terrible to happen. Snow lay thick over the ruins, but beneath it, the scars of recent disturbance were impossible to ignore once you knew where to look. Noah moved ahead with quiet vigilance, his movements cautious, his eyes tracing invisible lines between fallen beams, scorched walls, and tracks half hidden by drifting ice. Claire followed with slower steps, her injured ribs still protesting each breath, her arms secured in a sling beneath her coat. She had returned not as a grieving daughter now, but as an officer who no longer accepted coincidence. The puppies had been placed temporarily at the Everfrost Veterinary Clinic, sheltered and warm, watched over day and night by staff who had quietly grown attached to the fragile trio. But one thing still remained inside Echo Base, something Claire could not bring herself to abandon: the training logs, her father's handwriting, the truth that had waited 20 years beneath snow and silence. The sky darkened sooner than it should have, clouds gathering with unnatural speed over the mountains. The forest creaked in the rising wind. It was Noah who smelled the smoke first, faint but unmistakable beneath the cold. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Claire turned, her pulse quickening. "Someone followed us." The fire erupted without warning. A flash of orange tore through the far end of the compound as an explosion shattered the frozen quiet, sending flaming debris into the falling snow. Heat punched through the air in violent waves. The old wooden structures, dry and brittle beneath decades of cold, surrendered instantly. Flames raced along beams and collapsed roofs with terrifying hunger. Their glow reflected wildly across the drifting white like an open wound in the world. From the shadows beyond the tree line, figures emerged briefly, silhouettes moving with panic and purpose. They were not ghosts of the past. They were living men, armed not with history, but with desperation. The illegal group that had once occupied the base had returned to erase their trail for good. For months, they had used the abandoned facility to traffic train dogs for underground fighting and illegal security contracts, carving profit from brutality in a place meant to save lives. The appearance of 2 strangers had panicked them into action. They had chosen fire as their final answer. Noah grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her behind a fallen concrete barrier, just as another blast ruptured the rear wing of the compound. The heat surged forward, forcing them back toward the kennel ruins. Smoke swallowed the air, thick and biting. "We need to get out," Noah said urgently. And then Claire heard it, a sound that shattered every ounce of reason left in her body. A thin, trapped cry buried beneath crackling timber and roaring flame. Ash was inside. The puppies had been brought back temporarily that afternoon, while the vet coordinated their next transfer to a long-term facility. In the chaos of the sudden attack, no one had reached the kennels in time. Claire did not hesitate. She turned and ran straight into the inferno. "Claire!" Noah shouted, his voice torn apart by heat and thunder. He chased her without thinking, every step dragging him deeper into the memory of another mountain where fire and ice had once swallowed his world whole. Inside the collapsing structure, smoke blinded them. Wood splintered and dropped in fiery sheets. Claire dropped to her knees beside the damaged kennel, coughing violently, her injured ribs screaming as she tore at twisted metal with her bare hand. Leo and Star had already been dragged to safety by a worker moments before the explosion, but Ash had been trapped beneath a fallen beam, its small body pinned and shaking, its cry growing weaker with each breath. Claire wedged her shoulder beneath the beam, despite the pain that burned white-hot through her chest, and shoved with everything she had left. The beam shifted only a fraction, but it was enough for Noah to reach in. He wrapped his arms around Ash, shielding the tiny body against his chest as burning debris fell around them. A final blast thundered through the structure, collapsing the roof above their heads. Noah threw himself forward, using his own body as cover. Fire licked across his right arm in a violent sweep. The pain was immediate and savage, searing through muscle and nerve, but he did not let go. He ran blindly through smoke and flame. Ash held tight against his heart, until cold night air slammed into his lungs and the snow swallowed the fire's reach. They collapsed together just beyond the blaze. Noah's arms smoked, the skin blistering beneath torn fabric. Ash shivered violently but lived, its heartbeat frantic and real. Claire stumbled out seconds later and fell beside them, choking on smoke and terror and relief all at once. On the road below the base, the town of Everfrost began to stir. The first alarm did not come from sirens or radio towers. It came from Eleanor Pike. Eleanor was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair always tied neatly at her neck, the quiet owner of the town's only cafe, a place where grief and gossip traveled equally fast. That night, she had been closing her shop when she saw the sky above the mountains turn orange. Without hesitation, she rang every emergency number she knew and then drove herself toward the fire, headlights carving through snow and falling ash. By the time she reached the lower road, half the town had followed. Trucks, snowplows, volunteers with chains and hoses, men and women who had known each other through births, funerals, and long winters, showed up without being asked. They formed a living chain through fire and snow, hauling water, dragging burning debris away from the forest line, refusing to let the mountain claim another secret. Among the chaos, one of the men who had helped ignite the blaze stumbled from the smoke, disoriented and choking. He never reached the road. The fire took him where he fell, the smoke claiming his life in a silent, unseen moment. There were no cheers when his body was later found, only the heavy understanding that evil, once unleashed, always exacted its own price. Dawn broke gray and exhausted over Echo Base. The fire had died, leaving behind twisted frames and blackened snow that hissed softly as it melted. Claire sat on the tailgate of a truck with an oxygen mask pressed to her face, Ash wrapped tightly in her coat, trembling but alive. Noah lay nearby on a stretcher, his right arm badly burned, his face ashen with pain and shock. As the medics worked, his gaze remained fixed on the small movement at Claire's chest. He had lost count of how many lives he had carried through fire. This one felt different. Very quietly, as if spoken only to himself, he said, "You made it." Claire met his eyes through her own exhaustion and nodded once. The town stood behind them in the rising light, their faces streaked with soot, their hands raw from cold and water, their silence heavy with what they had nearly lost. Echo Base, once buried and forgotten, now lay exposed in ash and truth, and for the first time, its fire was no longer hidden. The fire left Echo Base standing in skeletons and ash, but what followed burned more slowly and far more deeply. Investigations arrived with clipped voices and measured boots. Federal agents, environmental officers, and canine crime specialists filled the mountain roads that had once erased all sound. The illegal operation unraveled piece by piece, timber stripped under false permits, dogs trafficked through coded routes, money washed through shell companies buried beneath rural silence. For 14 months, the truth moved at the speed of paperwork and testimony instead of flame. Claire Morgan watched it all from the sidelines of recovery, her police badge locked away in a drawer beside hospital discharge papers and physical therapy schedules. Her ribs healed unevenly, and her shoulder never quite returned to the strength it once had. For the first time since she had joined the force, she lived outside uniform. The town recognized her in quieter ways now, offering nods instead of salutes, casseroles instead of questions. She learned how silence felt when it was not enforced by duty, but chosen by circumstance. In those long months, Everfrost changed her without asking permission. Across town at the small veterinary clinic, Ash, Leo, and Star grew from trembling fragments into awkward-legged adolescents with paws too large for their bodies and instincts that awakened in unpredictable bursts. Ash bore the faintest discoloration in his fur where the fire had kissed him, a reminder of how close his life had come to slipping back into smoke. His temperament grew steady and deeply attentive, the kind of dog that pressed close when danger flickered unseen. Leo became all reckless joy and endless momentum, barreling through hallways and snowdrifts alike, with the confidence of something that had never known enough fear to be humbled by it. Star remained quiet, watchful, her dark eyes absorbing every human movement with the calm gravity of something born to read pain in silence. Noah visited them whenever his body allowed. His right arm had suffered infection deep in burned tissue, and twice the doctors warned him that they might have to take it entirely. Each warning reopened the old wound in his mind, the familiar terror of being reduced again, of losing not only function but purpose. Physical pain did not frighten him. Uselessness did. On nights when fever pinned him to the hospital bed and the world narrowed into white ceiling and beeping machines, he dreamed of fire and snow folding into one another until he could no longer tell which burned and which froze. When he finally returned to the cabin, thinner and quieter than before, he found the mountain no longer answered his solitude the way it once had. Something inside it had shifted. The investigation concluded at last with land seizures and criminal sentences that felt both monumental and insufficient. Echo Base was returned to the county under strict conditions. The name, once sealed and nearly erased, was released back into public record like a deep breath finally exhaled. When Claire stood at the gates again, more than a year after the fire, she did not feel the trembling urgency she once had. She felt weight. Purpose that asked for endurance instead of speed. The town council met with her, with Noah, and with a quiet group of residents who had stood in the fire that night. Plans were drawn with hands that still remembered holding hoses in blizzard wind. Echo Shelter was conceived not as a structure, but as an answer. Construction moved slowly, bound by permits, winter delays, and funding that arrived in cautious increments. Some money came from seized assets, some from state grants, some from private donations that arrived without names attached. The land resisted change at every turn. Foundations cracked under frost. Timber warped. Supply trucks slid off iced roads and had to be hauled back inch by inch. Claire returned to duty only partially at first, her body limited even as her resolve hardened. She transitioned into coordination and oversight, learning the language of legal reconstruction and nonprofit infrastructure alongside the rhythms of policing. Noah took responsibility for the land itself, supervising the clearing, the rebuilding, and the endless small catastrophes that never appeared on official budgets. There were days he doubted the worth of it all, days when his arm trembled too violently to lift tools, days when the mountain wind felt like a personal accusation. On those days, Ash pressed close against his side, steady and solid. Leo learned tracking under professional handlers, his natural drive sharpened into disciplined pursuit, his joy transformed into focus without losing its fire. Star was drawn instinctively toward people instead of paths, curling beside children in the clinic waiting room, resting her chin on trembling knees, reading sorrow with unspoken accuracy. 3 years passed without ceremony. Snow fell and melted and returned again. Scaffolds rose and vanished. Walls closed in, where ruin once stood open to sky. When Echo Shelter finally opened its doors, it did so quietly, without ribbon or speeches that sought to elevate it above grief. Claire stood at the entrance in civilian clothes, her badge now worn only in memory of where she had been and what she had become. She did not return to patrol, she returned to purpose. As coordinator of K-9 search operations and therapeutic animal integration, she built bridges between responders and survivors, between dogs trained to move toward danger and people learning how to breathe beside it again. Noah became the shelter's caretaker, in the truest sense of the word, managing the land, the dogs, and the silent mechanisms that kept life moving forward when no one was watching. His right arm never fully regained its strength, but it learned a different kind of endurance. The three dogs stepped fully into their callings. Ash trained into a rescue dog, his steady presence a calm axis in the chaos of collapsed buildings and lost hikers. Leo became a tracking specialist, relentless and precise, moving through snow and the forest with an instinct sharpened into near prophecy. Star remained close to human hearts, a therapy dog whose silence proved louder than words for those who had exhausted speech with their suffering. From the outside, Echo Shelter looked like any other mountain facility reinforced against winter. From within, it carried the layered weight of all that had tried to erase it and all that had chosen to build it anyway. Claire and Noah did not speak often of the fire anymore. They did not need to. The shelter itself did the remembering for them in wood and breath and movement. The fourth Christmas arrived without storm. Snow fell lightly over Echo Shelter like a careful blessing, settling in soft layers along the fence lines, the wooden roof, and the quiet paths that wound between kennels and training yards. The mountains stood clear and unthreatening beneath a pale winter sky, their shadows long and gentle instead of sharp with danger. Inside the shelter, warmth moved freely now, carried by breath, by footfalls, by the quiet pulse of life that had learned how to stay. The building no longer felt new, but it no longer felt wounded either. It felt lived in. Claire Morgan stood beneath the tall evergreen, planted at the center of the shelter's courtyard, her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee, watching volunteers string soft white lights through the branches. Her hair had grown longer since the fire, falling in loose waves instead of tight discipline, and though the scars on her shoulder never fully faded, they had lost their power to define her. She no longer carried the constant tension of pursuit. What she carried now was orientation, purpose that did not run, but remained. Across the yard, Noah Carter climbed a short ladder with deliberate care, his movements steady though slower than they once had been. In his hands, he held a single wooden star, cut by one of the local children weeks earlier, its uneven edges polished smooth by many small fingers. He fixed it at the highest point of the tree with quiet attention, then descended without ceremony. His right arm still bore the subtle stiffness of old injury, but he used it without apology now. The shelter had not healed him. It had taught him how to function alongside what could not be undone. The first arrivals came before dusk. A former soldier stepped through the gate, carrying an aging dog whose gray muzzle trembled with exhaustion and loyalty. The man moved slowly, every joint stiff with weather and memory, his posture rigid in the old habit of command, even as his eyes betrayed quiet uncertainty. Star approached first, her steps soundless across the snow. She did not rush, she did not inspect. She simply sat beside the veteran and placed her head lightly against his knee. The man exhaled a breath he had been holding for years and rested his trembling hand in her fur. Nearby, a widow arrived carrying a crate that rattled faintly with contained fear. Inside was a dog rescued from neglect, ribs visible, eyes too wide for comfort. Leo paced the perimeter with restless restraint, his energy contained but ready, tracking fear not as threat, but as something that could be guided. Under patient hands and steady presence, the frightened dog took its first tentative steps into safety. Ash waited near the entrance, his body aligned with the rhythm of the shelter, his attention always outward. When a small child appeared clutching a frayed scarf and nothing else, Ash rose and moved without command, placing himself between the unknown and the fragile, as if he had been born for this single moment. The child reached out with shaking hands and touched the warm solidity of living fur. Somewhere inside, a wall came down without noise. The shelter filled slowly with quiet arrivals, each carrying a private history that did not need to be spoken aloud. Claire moved among them with gentle authority, guiding, translating, stabilizing, her voice steady without hardness, warm without urgency. She no longer searched every face for what she had lost. She recognized what had arrived. When she paused at the tree again, Noah stood beside her without comment. They did not mirror one another. They did not reach for the language of romance. What bound them was not promise, but recognition. They had stood in the same fire. They had both chosen not to vanish afterward. "Your father would have understood this place," Noah said quietly, his gaze resting on the lights flickering to life across the shelter yard. Claire did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was calm. "I think he already did." Inside the main hall, the staff gathered quietly as Eleanor Pike arrived last, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a knitted hat, her arms full of wrapped pastries and careful humor. She did not speak of the night she had driven into fire without waiting for permission. The town did not need reminding. It lived inside the walls now. As the evening settled, Ash, Leo, and Star moved among the visitors like silent threads weaving disparate lives into a single living pattern. The veteran watched Ash guide his aged companion toward a warm corner with reverent disbelief. The widow found herself laughing softly as Leo, unable to restrain his nature entirely, slid across the polished floor in a wild arc that broke her grief into fragile pieces light enough to lift. The child who had entered with only a scarf curled beside Star and fell asleep with their forehead pressed together. Snow continued to fall outside, soft and patient. And for the first time since Echo Shelter had risen from ash, the mountain did not feel like a place of trial. It felt like a witness to continuity. Later, when the lights dimmed and the shelter grew quiet again, Claire stood alone beneath the tree once more. Noah approached carrying 2 small blankets. Together, without ceremony, they draped them over the dogs resting nearby. There were no words exchanged. None were needed. Claire thought of her father not as a ghost at the edge of memory, but as a path that had never ended, only changed shape. Noah thought of the men who had vanished beneath snow and fire years ago, not as a sentence, but as a weight that had finally been given direction. They had not become a storybook ending. They had become something rarer. They had become continuity. And as the 4th Christmas settled fully over Echo Shelter, the quiet truth revealed itself without spectacle or thunder. The miracle had not erased the past. It had given those who survived it the strength to live, without dying inside it. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a wounded dog that chooses to trust again, through a broken soul that chooses to keep loving, and through ordinary people who refuse to walk away. In our daily lives, we also face storms of fear, loss, and doubt, moments when the road feels closed and the night feels endless. But God walks beside us even then, guiding our steps through small acts of courage, kindness, and faith. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from, and type Amen. If you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, may the Lord bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, healing, and quiet miracles to light.